Ooh. Why, hello there. Brent here with BYOTools, and on today's episode, if you want to learn how we installed and made this beautiful walnut and epoxy mantle for my fireplace, keep on watching. Let's get started. Now this, of course, is our beautiful piece of walnut that we're going to be using for the mantle, but I wanted to spice it up a bit with some epoxy. So I'm actually going to be creating a form for this piece of wood that's actually already perfectly sized because it's approximately 58 inches long. So let's start making a form. And just like most epoxy projects, it all starts with the form. Now for this epoxy project, we are using a melamine board and I'm applying a visqueen wrap over the entire surface just to make sure that none of the epoxy is able to adhere to the melamine. With most melamines, it should not adhere to epoxy, especially if you're applying some type of form release or wax to the surface first, but with a plastic visqueen wrap, you ensure that there's no chance of the epoxy ever sticking to the mold itself. As for the sides of the form, I'm obviously using a piece of melamine here, but I also do use some miscellaneous pieces of plastic that I had laying around that just fit this space, and it was a quick, easy solution for this form. I also actually use the wood itself in order to seal the back side. All I had to do is apply a continuous bead of silicone on the back side as well as the sides of the board, and then actually use a pipe clamp to clamp it in place in order to guarantee that piece of wood was not going to go anywhere. At this point, wait for your silicone to dry, and guess what? It's time for epoxy. Now we are using Thick Set by TotalBoat, and a nice easy way to account for approximately how much epoxy you're going to need is actually just placing these bottles in place in order to fill up this whole space. Now it's obviously not a perfect science, but it does give you a general calculation of what you're going to need for this project, and in all honesty, this worked out quite well in my circumstance. Now because we're using a sizable amount of epoxy, I just grabbed a couple 5-gallon buckets, pouring all of the Thick Set epoxy into one bucket. I also have a secondary bucket in order to basically drain all the remaining amount of epoxy in that bucket so I don't have to wait for all the epoxy to spill out of each bucket. When working with a sizable amount of epoxy like this, you want to guarantee a proper mix as well as a thorough mix, and therefore I'm using a paddle mixer attached to my drill. Now the one key thing is that I want to introduce as little air to this mix as possible, so just make sure your mixing paddle is submerged in the epoxy throughout the entire process. Once the epoxy is mixed thoroughly, I then divide it between the two buckets because we are applying two different pigments. Both of them are going to be opaque, one's going to be white, and the other one is going to be black. Now, I haven't actually done this before, but I feel like it's going to be a really unique and different look because I personally haven't seen it on YouTube. I'm sure there is someone that has done it, but inevitably I personally have not seen this type of technique done with a opaque white and black pigment. As for the thought process behind the pour, I basically wanted to pour one side white, the other side black, and see what would happen in the middle as far as how the color would disperse between the two pigments. Now once the epoxy was poured, all I did to agitate it was just do a circular motion in the very center and then left it alone for a couple hours. I really didn't know what I was going to get at the tail end of this mixture because I hadn't done this before, but I was hoping for a very unique cellular looking shape between the two colors and it mixing in the middle. As you can see, that's what really started to occur and looked beautiful. Now I do promise that it looks beautiful by the end, but I have some frightful news for you. Check this out. I made one frightful error in my epoxy pour. It was too thick. Whoops. As you can see, it's getting quite hot. Oh boy, almost 200 degrees. Not so good. Remember, folks, do not pour your epoxy too thick, or this might happen to you. Now this definitely was an error on my part and I will explain it here shortly, but let's take this slab out of the framework first and then let's figure out what the damage is.
So, we all make mistakes, sometimes bigger than others. This one was definitely a mistake by my part because I didn't read the instructions. Yeah, instructions clearly state that you can only pour up to 1 inch thick on a larger pour like this. On smaller pours up to 2 inches, but 1 inch should have been max on this pour, which is why it started bubbling and overheating, because when you have a thicker epoxy pour like this means that you have to have an area in which the heat has to disperse. The heat couldn't disperse, so therefore it started overheating and bubbling. Yeah, note to self, I think we can still salvage it, so let's clean it up. Now this is our woodpecker's router sled system. This has a flattening bit on it and it actually planes down our wood very quickly and easily. This is an expensive unit, but it is worth its weight in gold. If you want a cheaper version, I have actually provided a video comparing this unit to a $20 unit. I think everyone should have one of these no matter what your budget is. So let's get this wood planed down correctly.
This 2-inch wide slab flattening bit from Bits and Bits is something that is a beauty to behold, and it really does a very nice job flattening out a slab like this very evenly and very consistently over the entire span. I do recommend taking thin passes in order to go over this entire surface without overworking your router. And I would say on average, I'm taking a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch maximum off of this slab per pass. In order to ensure that this slab stays put, I only need some Rockler bench cookies on the bottom because this thing is quite hefty. I will leave links in the description portion of this video if you do want to check out any of these products for your own woodworking project. Don't tell me you don't understand mask talk yet. I mean, it is 2020, right? Anyways, all I noted there was obviously it does make quite a mess, so just make sure you are protecting yourself by wearing a proper respirator as well as some eye and ear protection. At this point in time, I cleanly cut both ends and then took my Bosch turbo sander and started sanding away. Now I'm using the turbo mode on this sander and went from 60 grit all the way up to 200 grit. I would suggest going even higher, especially on the epoxy if we were going to be applying a standard wood finish, but instead I'm actually going to be applying a flood coat of epoxy on top of this surface, and therefore 200 to 300 grit sandpaper is plenty for this type of application. I set up a straight guide with a piece of leftover trim that I had lying around in order to cut a nice clean straight line all the way across the front and back portion of this slab with my circular saw. I will get a track saw one of these days, but in the meantime, a piece of trim and a couple clamps works perfectly fine for most circumstances. I clean up the edges again with the same process, going from 60 grit all the way up to 200 grit sandpaper, and at the tail end I actually use a sanding block with just a piece of sandpaper and a soft pad and apply a bit of pressure on all the edges. I would normally run my trim router around all these edges, but I felt like because of the thickness of this slab, I thought the beauty of the slab itself was going to say enough for itself, especially if it had a nice sharp crisp edge like this. Just trying to soften it up at this point. Once the sanding process is complete, I then take some mineral spirits and wipe off all the dust that I can with a clean lint-free cloth. And as you can see from the very get-go, it has a beautiful color dimension, and I can't wait to show you all what it looks like in the end. After it dries, I then take a tack cloth and remove all the excess dirt and grime off of this. You want to be quite diligent about this because anything that's left behind will definitely show up in the final product. For the top coat, I'm using Topher tabletop epoxy because not only does it leave a beautiful finish, but it also leaves a very smooth feeling finish in the end. Wow, I really emphasized the feeling on that one, but it really does make a distinct difference between the thick set epoxy versus this epoxy as far as feel goes. Don't ask me why, it just does. This mantle is approximately 12 inches wide by 58 inches long, and I mixed up approximately 12 ounces of this tabletop epoxy. In my opinion, this was the perfect amount to spread out the coating evenly, as well as have enough for it to drip off the edge as needed. All I use as an applicator is just this 4-inch plastic spreader, which does a masterful job of maneuvering all the epoxy and where I need it to be. Now you want a significant drip edge of epoxy because you want to ensure you have even coverage over the entire lip, but just make sure you go back over it with a finger and remove all the excess as it drips off because you don't want to leave a drip edge by the end of this. The next day, I flip the board over and then proceed to doing the exact same thing with the tabletop epoxy on the bottom side. However, I use a smaller batch and I am only applying it to the bottom side. I'm not allowing any of the epoxy to drip off the edge because that's not what we want due to the fact that that will just create irregularities on the top side, which is the last thing we want at this point. I apply a bit of heat to the epoxy just to pop all those miscellaneous air bubbles and then wait for it to dry.
Now this is looking fabulous, and the fact of the matter is, at this point, we're now time to install. But first, we need to install our bracket system. Now, I wanted a heavy-duty bracket system for this type of shelf because it is heavy and I don't want this thing to be going anywhere, which is why I'm going with a bracket from HOVR Solutions. This is a heavy duty channel bracket system, and the beauty about it is that it can actually hold up to 300 pounds, which is insanely amazing, especially for a floating shelf bracket system. I first have to actually channel out the back side a bit to make sure we can actually fit this channel into this position, then install the second bracket on the wall. Presto changeo, we're installed. So let's get to it.
I first determine where center is on my board as well as on the bracket, and then apply a piece of tape on both ends, basically just to dictate exactly where I need to cut to. I adjust the height of my table saw blade to the height of the bracket, and then move my fence in to approximately 1/4 inch from the blade. I rest the board up against my table saw fence and then do a plunge cut into the saw blade, doing this very carefully and slowly. Then after I have it plunged, I push it into the saw blade, cutting a continuous line all the way down. I check the bottom just to make sure it looks good and then proceed to cutting the remaining cuts. Now I'm moving the saw fence 1/8 inch every single time I push this through, and you can obviously do this with a dado set, which would make life a little bit easier, but not everyone has a dado set, so I figured I'd show you how to do it with a standard table saw blade. After I'm done cutting with the table saw, I then proceed to chiseling out all the remaining pieces of wood that weren't cut from the saw blade. This is quite easy to do, but just note this is not going to leave a perfectly smooth finish on the bottom side. Therefore, I'm taking a smaller bit to router out all the miscellaneous particles to fit it properly at the very bottom. One thing to note is that to have this bracket fully concealed, you need a board that's at least 2 inches thick. This board was 2 inches thick, but after all the planing and the sanding and so forth, it's actually closer to 1 3/4 inches, and therefore the bracket is not going to be fully concealed. However, I left the top intact, and you're not really going to be able to see much of the bottom side unless you're really trying to get underneath the shelf and look up, and you can tell me what you think by the end of this video. Once we have the bracket fully installed on the mantle, we can then proceed to the bracket that's going to be attached to the fireplace itself. Now for this installation process, we are obviously attaching this to a brick substrate, and therefore we need to make sure we have at least one fastener every 4 inches, which is why I have a pre-drill hole every 4 inches, and now we can line up those holes with the existing fireplace. Of course, the most important thing with this entire installation is to make sure that you have a bracket that is fully secured. And the one thing to keep in mind in order to do so is to actually pre-drill your holes through the grout line specifically, not the brick. The brick can be hollow in the middle, and therefore you want to ensure you have a properly supported fastener by installing your hardware through the grout line, not the brick. As you can see here, I did set up a laser level just to make life a little bit easier, and once they are, go ahead and suck out all the dust and debris and apply some anchoring epoxy to each hole. Now there are a number of different types of adhesives out there that you can use, but specifically keep in mind that you want a 2-part epoxy mix. That's what this large nozzle is for, because it actually pre-mixes the epoxy in the tube before it even exits the tube itself, which guarantees a proper mix. Then go ahead and install your wall anchors that are specifically designed for masonry and concrete work. I'll make sure and leave a link in the description box below on where to find the ones that I used in this application. Once you insert your fastener, it should feel very snug and secure from the very beginning. If it feels like it's twisting on you, it may be due to the fact that you drilled your pre-drilled hole a little too big, and therefore you need a larger anchor for that hole location. And as a quick side note, I did drill my first 2 holes a little lower than the rest by accident, and therefore I had to drill a secondary hole lower, which fit perfectly. Just try to avoid that if possible. As for the bottom, the system comes with a set screw, which basically secures both tracks in place once installed, and therefore it's not going to be moving on you anywhere once those are set in place. Keep in mind, especially when installing this bracket, is that you want to make sure that the brackets themselves are perfectly straight. If you don't have a straight surface to work off of, just make sure that the bracket stays straight and you actually shim it out a bit. It's better that way because the bracket will fit much nicer in the end. But guess what? At this point, all we have to do is now set our set screws, and guess what? We are done. I always love when a project comes together, and especially when you don't quite know what you're going to get. This is a project that I took on, and I really didn't know what I was going to get at the tail end of this project, but I absolutely loved the finished product. Hopefully you guys all do as well, and please note that this bracket is extremely strong and secure. I honestly feel like I could do chin-ups on this, and if you want me to test out how strong this thing is, let me know down in the comments below, because maybe I'll do a fun little post in the end to see how strong this thing really is. Between the warmth of the wood and the modern style of the epoxy, this piece really gives this whole fireplace area a whole new look and feel, and as always is one truly beautiful, sexy beast. Oh yeah.